This paper is about the quest for what I term here the mother tongue. It is both my quest and that of a language-deprived 10-year-old deaf girl. Both require an investigation into the developmental origins of language, and this is elucidated by excerpts from an infant observation. Excuse me. The deaf girl I call Virginia stole various things, such as money from her mother and small items of school equipment from her classroom. Consequently, I saw her weekly over her last 4 terms at primary school, from Easter until July of the following year. In what follows, I should like to examine what it was she was trying to steal, or, as I was to discover, to retrieve. I shall proceed by giving some background information, and then by describing our sessions. At the time I saw her, Virginia was bright, lively, uncommonly clumsy, stubborn, endearing, and at times near uncontrollably aggressive. Besides their alarm at her stealing, her teacher and her parents were concerned at their inability to manage her, when at times she became exasperatingly belligerent and obdurate. Before either her stealing or her behavior was a matter for concern, the school had for several years been worried about her lack of language development, which lagged noticeably behind that of her deaf classmates. According to her audiogram, she was one of the deafest children in the school, yet from the time she started school, there had been an ambiguity about the degree of her deafness. From her voice, or lack of it, and from her lack of response, she seemed to be very deaf. From her voice and from her lack of response, she seemed to be very deaf, yet there were times when this conclusion seemed questionable. For instance, on one occasion, when she had her back to me, making a hot drink with half a jar of my instant coffee, I groaned at normal speech level, "Oh, Virginia." She looked at me questioningly, having, I think, heard some of the vocalization. The cause of her profound perceptive or nerve deafness was unknown and was presumed to have been from birth. Virginia was the second of 5 children and the only member of the family who was deaf. Her parents consistently believed that she should be taught lip reading because they felt she would be excluded from the usual advantages and opportunities available to those in the hearing world if she were taught sign language. Virginia seldom used her voice and communicated through gestures, which her mother and older brother seemed to understand. For a long period, she was especially close to her older brother, with whom she fought, but to whom she was also very attached, as he seemed to be to her. He had often accompanied Virginia to school fetes and parties. At the time I started to see Virginia, he was entering adolescence and was seldom seen with her at the school. She also had 2 younger sisters and a baby brother. She had been quite involved with the care of the second sister when a baby, and their closeness remained until the sister began talking, whereupon the sister preferred to be with others who spoke. When her little brother was born, Virginia was also involved with looking after him. There were times when he screamed at such a pitch that the mother could not stand to be near him, and Virginia would turn off her hearing aids, pick him up, and patiently comfort him. Virginia started school at the end of her 2nd year, at the beginning of a period of considerable change in deaf education. Until a year before I became the social worker there, the school, typical of schools for the deaf in this country, taught lip reading and discouraged sign language. This was done with the genuine conviction that it was damaging to deaf children to isolate them from the world in which the majority used spoken communication. The year I began work at the school, in 1977, a select number of pupils were being taught sign language as well as lip reading. Originally, this was done in an effort to reduce the behavior problems of these children, which to a certain degree it succeeded in doing. 6 years later, by which time Virginia had been taught lip reading for 4 years, there was a major shift in deaf education. Sign language was taught throughout the school, although this meant teachers were having to learn simultaneously with introducing it to the children. At the time I started to see Virginia, the impoverishment of her language was obvious. Language deprivation in deaf children is a central concern of Oliver Sacks in Seeing Voices, his book, in which he vigorously attests to the human need for language, whether visual or auditory. Sacks describes a deaf boy who, because of misdiagnoses, did not enter school until he was 11. That was Virginia's age. And I quote from Sacks, "He perceived that something was going on between us, but he could not comprehend what it was. He had as yet almost no idea of symbolic communication, of what it was to exchange meaning." Later, Sacks comments on the absence of questioning and the very incomprehension of question forms that so struck him when he met other pupils at the boys' school. This was also true of Virginia, who had, to a lesser degree than the boy, a limited sense of language as a means of symbolic exchange, and of the different kinds of statements one can make, for instance, declarations as opposed to questions. Her confusion at some of my questions represented more a lack of understanding statement forms than of misunderstanding a specific communication. In regard to our communicating, to begin with, there was as much lack of understanding as there was presence of it. Virginia could not speak discernibly, save for a very few words, like no and no way, and although she was being taught signing, she had, as I have explained, limited understanding of language and what it is about. I had some signing skills, but basically it was a foreign language to me, initially poorly expressed by Virginia. Added to this were the demands of trying to understand what Virginia was trying to communicate of her feelings and to manage her impulsiveness. I was very dependent on my supervisor, Dorothy Davidson, who taught me how to rely upon projective identifications, the thoughts and emotions that Virginia aroused in me, to understand her feelings. And this is a concept I have found really essential in my work, and what Miranda was referring to in her introduction. In the course of time, Virginia and I developed a good enough way of communicating, based upon a kind of pidgin sign language, gestures, mime, drawing, and simple written messages. This served until her command of sign language significantly outmatched my own. I shall now describe Virginia's quest by using clinical material. I shall be focusing on 3 particular sessions, 1 at the beginning and 2 toward the end of her treatment. In our painfully unpropitious first session, I understood virtually nothing of Virginia's communications, either analytically or in terms of signing. The feelings of being misunderstood and rejected which this evoked then became acted out. For the next 2 sessions, she refused to see me in my room, although I was able to persuade her to go to the shops with me during our second meeting, and in the third I joined her in her classroom. As the 4th session approached, I felt a strong sense of failure when I considered that she would yet again refuse to come. This was followed by a sense of relief that I would no longer have to suffer her lacerating rejections, which left me with feelings of thorough worthlessness and intense pain, the nature of which I had never been aware of experiencing before. It was at this point that Dorothy Davidson introduced the idea that these feelings had their source in Virginia, and then I felt that I had a way of understanding her. To my astonishment and relief, Virginia willingly came to the 4th session and commenced a sequence of play that became a pattern for the rest of the term. Rather than acting out her rejection of me, she rejected me in pretend. Rather than steal, she began a process in which she was able to recover something which she seemed to feel had been taken from her or lost. Only long after our session stopped was I able to understand the nature of this something. To give a flavor of our early sessions, and to start to examine the meaning of her stealing, I shall describe in detail our 5th session. This, as all our sessions, took place in the school medical suite, composed of 2 small rooms joined by a door. The first room was where I had my desk, telephone, files, storage cabinet, and 2 soft chairs. The second was the medical room, which contained a bed with a screen on wheels around it, a table with chairs, a desk lamp, a sink, and miscellaneous medical equipment. I think I'd also like to add here that in my notes, which I'm reading out, I refer to Virginia, that she says something or asks something or tells me something, and it gives the impression that she is talking to me. She isn't. This is my own shorthand of describing a communication which may have been expressed by pointing, facial expression, gesture, or mime. These are from my notes. As Virginia gets inside the door, she looks at me and then away, and sloppily signs "fed up," although she seems excited and pleased. She comes and sits in the chair near me, and then ducks behind me to open the lower filing cabinet drawer where her box of toys is. She has a brief exchange with me, which serves to re-establish contact, and then indicates by her action that it's time to play our game. She takes her toys and the drawing tablet into the medical room and slams the door behind her. I sit in a chair on the other side of the door and occasionally make attempts to go into the room, pretending to beg her to let me play with her. Please, please let me play with you. One time when I go in, she's going through the contents of the box, looking carefully at each item as if she were taking inventory of a treasure chest. Since our last session, I've put in a toy bottle of milk and some plasticine, and she asks about them, bringing the bottle to the door where I'm pleading to play with her. I explain that the last time we met, she wanted some milk, but I couldn't get any. This is pretend milk, and she says she remembers last week. Eventually, she lets me into the medical room, and I notice that she has placed the lamp and the box of toys neatly on one side of the table, an arrangement similar to that on my desk. She puts me to bed with no drink and pulls the screen around the bed, and then pulls the curtain around the screen. While I'm in the bed, she says that if I'm to have anything to drink, I have to be good and go to sleep. She makes a number of trips into my room, causing me some anxiety because my handbag is there, and I know she's a little thief. She gets a styrofoam cup from the cabinet, and then a card and an envelope. After a bit, she comes and asks if I've been good. When I answer that I've been very good, she gives me a quick V sign. I'm left alone for several minutes before I venture out of bed and around the screen and curtain to where she's set up a place for me opposite her at the table. She is pretending to be the teacher, and when I indicate in pretend obsequiousness that I want to sit closer to her, she firmly places me back in my chair. She starts to organize schoolwork to do and tears off 2 sheets of paper, giving me one and keeping the other for herself. At this point, she looks out the window at the nursery class playing in the sun. I draw a small unhappy face and label it "Sad Baby" with E for my initial at the top, and a larger scowling face next to it labeled "Hard Mother" and V at the top. Hard is upon the sign for hard. She looks at my drawing and corrects the eyebrows of the larger face so that they are not scowling, and hands me the paper back. I say, "No pretend. Do you think that crying babies are bad?" She answers yes. I draw a sad baby face and label it "Bad Baby." She then takes it and tears it up while still looking out the window. She looks out for several minutes while I'm trying to engage her in a no-pretend conversation. She turns to me and bossily orders me to cry, which I pretend to do, whereupon she rolls her eyes and circles her index finger around one side of her head in the common gesture of "you're crazy." I indicate that it's getting to be time. She takes out the unopened package of plasticine from the box and starts to open it. I sign that we're finished, but she continues to open it. I say that she can play with it next time, but she stubbornly ignores me and persists in wrapping the plasticine in a page she's torn out of her drawing pad. She puts it away in the box and puts the lid in place. She then starts to leave the room with the box under her arm. I stop her by using signing and say that the boys in her class will want the toys and that we need the toys in order to play together. She obstinately holds on to the box, while I, awkward at this war of wills, say she can choose one toy to take, but not all. She insists on taking them all. Helpless, I submit, and ask if she's going to bring the box next week. She answers yes. This she did, making what might have been stealing or confiscation into an exchange. She takes something from me and then gives something back. This exchange is marked by ruthlessness on Virginia's part and intense anxiety on my part. The anxiety I experienced was related to dependency, because I felt that if she took all the toys and did not return them, we would not be able to continue to meet. This feeling was not based upon reality, because her play with me did not involve the toys. It involved playing school and hospital. But the toys were a means of exchange that served as a fundamental link between us. For the remainder of the term, the pattern of play continued. The toy box was collected and taken into the medical room, from which I was barred until it suited her to allow me inside. Then I took on the role of helpless and blundering pupil or patient or child in relation to Virginia's cruel and demanding teacher or doctor or parent. Within the familiar pattern of play, there were significant changes. She used her increasing communication skills to tell me to wait, rather than slamming the door shut and leaving me out. We had been able to work out ways of accommodating one another that allowed for moments of goodwill and, less occasionally, feelings of softness. At our last meeting of the term, she acknowledged sadness that we would not be meeting over the summer holiday. By the end of the term, Virginia had shown considerable changes outside her sessions as well as within. Her behavior both at home and in class had improved. Her parents told me that she had changed 100% in her attitude. She was more relaxed in herself and was more interested in joining in activities with others. Her communication skills had developed, and she was confident enough in her ability to communicate to have occasional chats with a speech therapist. Also, I had looked through the school accident book, where her name had been logged more than any other child's for regular falls, cuts, and bruises. There was no entry for her during the term from Easter to the summer break. To the best of my or anyone else's knowledge, she had not stolen from home or school since the first time she saw me. However, when I took Virginia's toys home with me over the long summer holiday, I happened to look inside. There, along with the small toys I had provided, was a strange toy I'd not seen before. It was a tiny, soft cushion, probably part of furniture for a doll's house, that only Virginia could have put there. Something had been added to which stood for our means of exchange. That is, she contributed something of her own to what passed between us. Granted, this is done surreptitiously, but it conveyed by its size and texture an element of tenderness. When we resumed meeting the following autumn, Virginia's play continued to reflect change. The complementary roles that we assumed in our play became less oppositional and less marked by a hierarchy of status. We drew silhouettes of one another using a lamp and paper tacked on the wall. Later, she pretended that we were friends, and we talked on the phone and went for car rides together. The development of this new person-to-person rather than role-to-role relationship reached a climax in our last session before the Easter break, just a year after we started meeting. At the start of the session, she had pulled out some disused speech therapy equipment that had been stored in my room for several weeks, but hardly noticed by her. Using some of this equipment and the procedure with which she was familiar, she pretended to give me a hearing test. That is, she made various vocalizations behind me, and pretending to be deaf, I raised my hand when I heard. This is from my notes. We do this several times, and then she wants me to give the test to her. We change places so that I am standing behind her, so she can't see what I'm saying, and she is sitting with the headset on. I say Virginia, and then her last name, and she responds by raising her hand each time I do this. At first I think she's just moving her hand when she expects me to be making a sound, but she turns and smiles and says she hears me. I ask what she heard me say, and she says, Virginia. I ask her what was the second word. She says, Elizabeth, and I explain I said her last name. I indicate that I will say either her first name, her last name, or my name, which is a typical procedure in testing residual hearing. We're both pleased and excited about her hearing me. I say, I thought you couldn't hear, in signing, and add that the earphones keep things out. She removes them and turns away from me and repeats fairly accurately which of the words I've said. Then she puts the earphones on me and gives me the test, saying the three names, and I fingerspell the answer. Sometimes it's difficult to make out what she's saying, and I make a mistake. She tells me tactfully when I've got it wrong. The subsequent session picked up from where this one had left off, despite there being a 4-week Easter break between the two. At the beginning of the session, Virginia was obviously pleased to see me, and having darkened the room as before, again gave me a hearing test. She then wanted me to go with her into the school hall, and there she directed me to pick a song from several that were written on posters hung on the wall, and to write down the words on a piece of paper. When I had done this, she asked me to finish the song she had started to copy. When I finished, we go back to my darkened room. She places me in the corner in front of the lamp and turns it on. She wants me to sing the first song, Spotlight on Me, while she holds the music, or the words on the paper, and after a fashion, directs by signing the words. At the end of the first song, the one I've chosen, she switches, so she stands in the corner in the spotlight, and she tells me to sign the words of her song, which I do. Together we perform the song together, my inarticulate signing accompanying her flat yet enthusiastic tones, the words of the song being all but indiscernible. I know that, Harvey, you've had experience with the deaf, but I don't know if others of you know what a deaf voice sounds like, or the voice of a deaf person sounds like. You say that you do. The way, what her singing, as I'm calling it, would have been, the point was not that she was singing as we understand it, or using the words discernibly, but that she was vocalizing what she had. It was noticeable that she was confident enough to not only do it, but enjoy it. She intently watches my hands while I sign, and sings wholeheartedly, swaying rhythmically back and forth from one foot to the other. When we finish, she turns and stands opposite to where she stood to sing, and applauds, and has me do the same. There is enthusiastic appreciation in the applause, and a curtain call. I'd now like to comment on the clinical material that I presented. The feelings that were aroused in me by Virginia during these two sessions helped me to understand what was happening not only in these two particular interviews, but also how they represented a culmination of something that had been developing all along. What I felt during and following these two sessions was an intense and idealized specialness and closeness to Virginia. Feelings opposite to the rejection and worthlessness I experienced at the beginning. These were important clues to me, which, when I thought about them, enabled me to consider how Virginia's play expressed fantasies she had about communicating. These thoughts can be summarized as follows. At the time I started seeing her, Virginia seemed to equate being deaf with not being able to communicate and to being rejected. By the end of the first term, there was evidence, namely the tiny cushion, that the foundations of communication had been established between us, and not surprisingly in retrospect, this was accompanied by an improvement in her communication skills. When the autumn term started, this development not only continued, but gained momentum. This development can be described as the enfolding, or for those who are aware of Fordham's work, the deintegration, of a complex fantasy of idealized good communication, in which there is a close and special togetherness with another, without pain of not understanding or of being misunderstood. To Virginia, ideal communication could only occur if one were hearing, and by implication speaking. Thus, she could only really communicate while in imaginative or projective identification with an idealized hearing and speaking person. From the feelings I experienced at the time, she was clearly in this state of mind in the 2 sessions involving the hearing test equipment. As she had undergone actual hearing tests many times, I think that she responded as she did because she knew what to expect, and not because she could actually hear. That is, beyond some residual hearing, which may have come to have more value for her. So when she said that she could hear, she meant that she was projectively identified with me as a hearing person, and felt she could hear. She also felt that she could speak, and this was expressed in singing together with me, while in projective identification with an idealized speaking or singing object. The idealized state she sought and seemed temporarily to experience with me in these 2 sessions did not, of course, last. On the one hand, her signing skills had significantly improved beyond my own. When I could not follow what she was signing, she became frustrated, impatient, and contemptuous. On the other hand, she had known from the beginning of the school term that we were finishing. In one of our last sessions, I was a patient and went to the doctor, Virginia, and received a prescription. But when I went to the pill shop, there were no pills to be had. This seemed to express Virginia's feelings about finishing. My shop would not be able to fill her need for help because there was no more understanding to be had. This was due to our ending, as well as to the limits of my sign language. To summarize our work, I think that in achieving a state of mind in which she felt that she could hear me and felt that she could speak to me, Virginia had been able to acquire honestly, that is by hard work, what previously she had only been to attempt to get by stealing. This was possible because of the way Virginia was able to use her therapy, as well as because she was being taught sign language. Both her therapy and the availability of signing were necessary for the changes in Virginia, and one without the other would have been unproductive, I think. I have so far described Virginia's quest as that for the experience of being in communication with another. However, at this point, a new question arises. If Virginia had been born deaf from birth, and without a visual language until she was 10, how did she know what she was missing? Or, put differently, was Virginia trying to steal something that she did not have, or retrieve something she once had but which had got lost? To address this question, I'm turning to infant observation. Language development is sometimes used to mark the end of infancy and the beginning of childhood, yet its sources are to be found in infancy. In the following excerpts from an infant observation, I am focusing on the early exchanges between the baby Toby and his mother to demonstrate this. The first observation to which I am turning is when Toby is 2.5 months, by which time he had established a good relationship to the breast, which I think is clear in the observation. The feed is followed by a nappy change and what his mother calls a conversation with Toby. I would like you to notice how the nipple in the mouth, in Toby's mouth, during the satisfying feed, is followed by movements of Toby's tongue in his mouth, and that this is followed by a proto-conversation between him and his mother during the nappy change. When I entered the bedroom, Toby was crying. His head was on the pillow and his face screwed up into a cry, and he rocked his head from side to side and held his arms out in front of him. His mother picked him up and sat down, and pulled her robe aside so that he could feed. He sucked heartily for several minutes, making throaty noises and moving his cheeks rhythmically. At one point his mother held him away a bit and asked, "Would you like to be winded for a bit, or go back to feeding?" She paused for a moment, looking into his face, and then took him back to her breast, where he continued to feed for several more minutes, before she sat him up to wind him. After winding him for about 5 minutes, the mother turned him around with his head resting on her right elbow, his eyes watching her. She looked at him intently, and occasionally, when she was talking to him, broke into a broad grin. Toby resumed vigorous sucking. After about 5 minutes, Toby pulled away from the breast and looked up into his mother's face. She asked, "Are you finished?" and waited for a moment before putting him back to her nipple. He began to suck again, but more slowly than when he first fed. He then stopped sucking, and she asked again, "Are you finished now?" Again she pulled him toward her right nipple and held him there for a minute. Although he had taken the nipple into his mouth, she said, "He's not doing anything." She then turned him around and sat him on her leg to wind him. He looked at me and smiled. I noticed again this time, as I had the last visit, how he seemed to play with his tongue. It seemed to move within his mouth, causing his cheeks to move, and occasionally he would stick it out as if savoring it. She turned to him and said, "There now, time to have your nappy changed." Her tone to him was very affectionate, and her questions asked in such a way as if he might really answer. She undid his baby grow and talked to him. He began what she calls his conversation. He made a series of noises which have the rhythmic inflection of someone speaking. His mother looked down to him and smiled and talked back to him, sometimes asking him to say that again. While he was talking, his face changed expression. He would knit his eyebrows together in an intent expression, smile, or he just looked around with raised eyebrows, as if expecting something. There was something uncanny about this very little baby making facial expressions as he vocalized with inflection, as if he were really talking. Now, this mutually satisfying feed includes not only taking in milk, but also touching, talking to, and looking at one another. In fact, at one point, Toby interrupts his sucking to look into his mother's face. He lingers at the breast after sucking and holds the nipple in his mouth, and when taken from the breast, the nipple is replaced by his tongue. Thus, a good feed, which has various components, is located for Toby in his mouth, first as a nipple in his mouth, and then as his tongue in his mouth. This is followed by a nappy change and Toby's conversation, which is a series of varyingly expressive vocalizations employing the same inflection that is used after speech is acquired. Originally, I was inclined to view the replacement of the nipple by the tongue as a defense against the loss of the breast. Influenced by Michael Fordham's model of the primary self, I am now inclined to see it as developmental. That is, the nipple in the mouth of a good feed is a proto-phenomenon which separates out or deintegrates into, say, container-contained, a good intercourse, and as I hope will be shown, a word in the mouth. I shall now turn to an observation when Toby is 6 months, 3½ weeks old. Earlier in the observation, Toby was in the kitchen playing with various objects, and it was notable that his main preoccupation had shifted from people to things. I know that in infant research they have made it very clear that infants shift from being fascinated by people and their faces to things at about this age. In what follows, the mother left temporarily to take Toby's older sister to nursery school, and I was alone with him for about 20 minutes. I would like you to notice again what is happening around his mouth. Although he had been protesting up until this time, he became quiet. I picked him up, and he sat on my leg and leaned forward and dug his fingers into a hole in the chair covering. I noticed that his mouth was pulled in as it is when one forms the letter B. I spoke to him, and he looked up at me and then away again. I turned him around to face me. He leaned forward and reached out for the front of my sweater and breasts, feeling the texture of my sweater. After a while, he lay back a bit, half upright, resting against my body and arm. A couple of times he turned his head against my shoulder and breast, as if expecting to suck. I talked to him and he relaxed. I felt I was running out of conversation, but that my voice was soothing to him, so I began to sing a little lullaby. Simultaneously, I was rubbing his stomach with my fingers. His lids lowered as he watched my fingers rub his tummy, and then he looked away at nothing in particular, seeming to concentrate on listening to my voice. He seemed relaxed and pulled his right arm around so that he could suck on his fingers, and waved his left hand in the air. He watched his left hand as he moved it around. He looked up at my face and then at my mouth, and then reached for my mouth and touched it as it moved when I sang, still sucking on the fingers on his other hand. In this observation, Toby's cognitive, muscular, and relational development has blossomed. Specifically, the nipple in the mouth has extended to include fingers in the mouth. There is a parallel development in his awareness of inside-outside, and fingers are used to explore this dimension. For example, the finger into the rip in the chair covering, and into Toby's own and my mouths. His interest has shifted from people to objects, and he is developing fine motor control which enables manipulation. Increased muscular control also applies to his tongue and labials, as his infant cooing, which is made up of primarily vowel sounds, develops to include consonants. In this, it's the B mouth shape. On the one hand, as with the first observation, there is in this one an experience at the breast, in reaching for it, followed on by an exchange with another. On the other hand, there are developments in this observation beyond what was seen in the first. In particular, exemplifying both his new interest in objects in contrast to people, and his developing awareness of the dimension of inside-outside, Toby uses his fingers to reach out towards the song word object, which he locates in my mouth. This he does simultaneously with sucking on the fingers of his other hand. So he's sucking and reaching out toward my mouth, which is making a sound. So that one can formulate that there is a link between the fingers in the mouth, which derive from the nipple in the mouth of the good feet in the first observation, and the song word in the mouth. To support this formulation, I shall describe part of the subsequent visit. Once again the mother had left him with me while she took his sister to school. He sat on the mat on the floor and started to cry. I picked him up and held him on my lap in the chair and offered him some toys. He again made little crying m, and b noises. I held him partially upright and talked to him. I began singing to him, and he stopped crying and looked up and watched for a long moment. He then made agitated movements before becoming quiet again. He started to talk as if commenting on something that was going on, and reached for my mouth. He made sucking movements in his mouth as I rubbed his tummy. Now in this observation, my song word in the mouth is linked by Toby's reach to his vocalizations in his mouth and his sucked tongue in the mouth. Thus, what was originally the nipple in the mouth of a good feed can be traced via the tongue in the mouth, fingers in the mouth, and vocalizations in the mouth to a song word in the mouth. All of these experiences occurring within emotionally colored exchanges with another. This, then, is the mother tongue to which I referred in the beginning. The description of Toby's language development is not complete until the word is in his own mouth. I am skipping almost 20 months to the time when he was 2 years, 2 months, 2.5 weeks to complete the picture. Toby smiled when he saw me. His mother asked him, "Who is it?" And Toby, having been able to identify me by name for at least a month, said, "Francis." His mother said it wasn't Francis, and Toby said, "Elizabeth." He said something I couldn't understand about a story, and then repeated, "Let's read a story." I followed him into the sitting room and sat down while Toby brought me a book. He and I read it as he stood by my knee. He repeatedly pointed to the pictures of the mice and said, "Das a rabbit," but after a bit conceded, "Das a mouse." There was a picture of a fly on one of the pages, and I asked him what it was. "Das a spider," he answered. I said, rather didactically, that I thought it was a fly. "It's a helicopter," he retorted conclusively. Later he changed this. "Das a fly." By 26 and a half weeks, Toby had come to know a lot about language. Not only did he have a good vocabulary, which he could will to use accurately or not, but he also knew about statements, questions, and imperatives. He also knew about verbal one-upsmanship, and that his helicopter outmatched my fly. I have tried to show how what eventually became the richness of Toby's language had its origin in an object, the thing in the mouth, that was simultaneously a good feed. One in the same thing. The object is an experience. By now you have gathered that it was that, I think, which Virginia was trying to steal, or more accurately, to retrieve. Before this conclusion can be accepted, there is one more point to add. To do this, I would like to repeat the part of the first observation that describes the post-feed proto-conversation Toby had with his mother during the nappy change, and compare that to the proto-conversation of a baby girl just the same age as Toby. That's 2.5 months. This is just to bring back in your minds the first observation. She undid his baby grow and talked to him. He began what his mother calls his conversation. He makes a series of noises which seem to have the inflection of someone speaking in them. His mother looked down at him and smiled and talked back to him, sometimes asking him to say that again. While he was talking, his face changed expression. He knit his eyebrows together in an intent expression, he smiled, and he just looked around with raised eyebrows, as if expecting something. There was something uncanny about this very little baby making facial expression as he vocalized with inflection, as if he were really talking. And now an excerpt from an observation of the baby girl, the same age. Amy's grandfather held her so as to be level with my face. She looked at me and smiled, waved her arms and legs, and made noises and raspy syllables in the back of her mouth. I could talk to her when she finished her vocalization, so that we had a conversation. In this conversation, she made single syllable and e sounds from her mouth and chest, and a couple of squeals, and some multiple syllable sounds that in my imagination I could easily make into "Hello, how are you?" That is, she had in her voice the same song or inflection of someone saying this. Our conversation went on for 4 or 5 minutes. Half an hour later, she began another conversation, body wiggling. There were a series of waves of smiles, crescendoing with her sounds. These crests were accompanied by vocalizations, a variety of human speaking sounds, that is, having the inflection of someone speaking, and a range of pitch and tone. She talked in the crest of the wave, and I talked in the fall. The proto-conversations between Toby and his mother, and between Amy and me, are virtually identical. Each infant is in relation to an adult via alternating vocalizations in which both adult and infant use the same general pattern of inflection, that is, human inflection. In neither case does it matter whether words are being used or understood. What does matter is that there is a meaningful exchange via alternating expressive vocalizations. The only significant difference between Toby and Amy is that Toby is hearing and Amy is deaf. I'd now like to return to Virginia and her quest, and to conclude this. The quest in which she was trying to get for herself the object that is the thing in the mouth, which is also a relationship, in which there is a meaningful exchange and a feeling of being together with another in shared understanding. In infant proto-conversations, from which Virginia was not excluded by virtue of her deafness, it makes no difference whether the utterances have specific meanings. It is the emotional quality, the meaningfulness of the exchange that counts. In terms of language development alone, Virginia's loss of the thing in the mouth, that is also a good relationship, was perhaps inevitable. Not untypically, her deafness was not diagnosed until she was in her second year. This is well beyond the second half of the first year when babbling develops, and when the mother helps her child to establish a preference for certain babbled sounds. For instance, when Toby was about 10 months, his mother reported to me that he had said "dada." Now her responses to this, and her repetition of this particular utterance, would indicate to Toby that it had a meaning. In this way, babbled utterances develop into phonemes, the alphabet of the sounds of a language, and every language has its own phonemes. So English phonemes are not the same as German phonemes, which are not the same thing as Chinese phonemes. It is clear that the baby must be able to hear in order to establish which of his or her vocalizations have meaning when he or she babbles. Of course, Virginia could not do this, and this was the first step towards language deprivation, and to her, the loss of the mother tongue. By establishing a relationship with me, in which the fundamentals of communication could be established or re-established and developed, Virginia was able to retrieve an experience of the thing in the mouth that is also a relationship of shared meaning. This developed alongside the acquisition of a word in the hand that could serve the same purpose as the word in the mouth, which was denied to Virginia because she could not hear.